Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for May 23rd, 2022. Many people sometimes ask, why does LaRouche focus so much during his lifetime on the British role in shaping U.S. policy? Isn't it an American empire with the British hanging on? Well, there are a couple of developments that I think will show you once again that it's the Brits who are calling the shots because it's British imperial policy centered around the City of London and Wall Street and the enforcement of policies to benefit the global cartels, which include many powerful networks out of London that are calling the shots. Let me just give you these three examples. And by the way, what these examples will show you is forget about this idea of a return to normal. There is no normal. We're heading into a period of permanent warfare and permanent austerity. That's what the Great Reset and the Green New Deal represent, and that's why there's a war going on in Ukraine, which is a US-NATO war against Russia, and why they're pushing to provoke a similar situation with China. So let's begin with the role of the British think tanks that operate on the highest level of the integration of intelligence, military, and financial operations. The Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, their Deputy Director General, Malcolm Chalmers, has issued a call for what he calls a Cuban Missile Crisis on steroids over Crimea. What his argument is that there's a need to create a greater crisis if you're going to have a negotiated settlement. So he said that the rearmed Ukraine should insist on and move towards retaking Crimea. This would be treated by Russia as an existential threat, and it's likely, he argues, that Putin would then move to put nuclear forces on alert, creating a Cuban Missile-style crisis over Crimea. This, he then goes on to argue that this would create an opportunity. What? An opportunity based on the nuclear war? Yeah, an opportunity to make a negotiated settlement easier. The paper is titled, "This War Still Presents Nuclear Risks, Especially in Relation to Crimea." And keep in mind that RUSI is the Crown's principal military think tank since 1831. Now, a more recent think tank called the Henry Jackson Society is doing its job for creating the conditions for war with China. Keep in mind that one of the founders of the Henry Jackson Society is Sir Richard Dearloffe, former head of MI6, who is responsible for the dossier on the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq used by the Bush-Cheney administration for the war that was launched against Iraq. Dearloffe also was the primary promoter and defender of former MI6 operative Christopher Steele, who was at the center of the creation of the document involved in Russiagate attacks against Trump and Putin. Now, the Henry Jackson Society has put together what they call a strategy piece on how the Five Eyes, that is the intelligence services connected to Britain and the United States, which include New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, should force through an economic decoupling with China to create an existential economic crisis in China. They admit this would be hard on the countries involved because so much of the production to serve the needs of those countries comes from China. But they say it's necessary to contain China. And then as you do this, as you have an economic policy to decouple, to deprive China of the trade and the benefits of trade, you could then escalate for the separation of Taiwan from China. This is reminiscent of another one of these British think tanks, which is actually in the United States, but it was set up to coordinate British-US policy, called the Atlantic Council, which last year put out a document called the Longer Telegram, which essentially argued that the Western countries should use economic and military pressure on China to provoke a regime change there. So the goal of these two policies, from RUSI and from the Henry Jackson Society, is regime change against Russia and China. And the risk of war implicit in that is something which they take for granted and are willing to risk a war in order to carry out their degradation of those two nations, to take them out of the camp of sovereign nations, to end any opposition whatsoever to the real policy of these elites, which is the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. Now, putting this together is what happened with Chatham House, which is the center of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which is the head of British intelligence, the center of British intelligence. They just announced that the former Bank of England governor, Mark Carney, who is currently serving as the UN envoy on climate action and finance, they've named him chairman of Chatham House's panel of senior advisors. So this connects the intelligence community with the war policy, with the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. Carney is the person who coordinated the agreement under which hundreds of financial institutions, including banks, leading banks, insurance companies, hedge funds, and others, would withhold any credit from any company or country which engages in investment in fossil fuel technologies. The idea of a boycott of credit to anyone that refuses to go along with the Green New Deal. This is the imposition of a global government which rejects the idea that any sovereign nation has a right to its own policies. Now, the sovereignty versus imperial policy will be on display starting today in Davos, Switzerland, as the World Economic Forum is having its first in-person conference in over 2 years. You know who the first speaker is? Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. He'll be giving the opening remarks there, and there's a large Ukrainian delegation there, and the Russians are banned from attending this year. Zelensky yesterday issued a call that Western nations ensure that the $300+ billion stolen from Russia, that is of Russian assets and funds that are held in Western banks, that money be given to Ukraine for reparations and reconstruction. So as Davos reconvenes, they'll be putting the Ukraine situation at the forefront. That is the war, the use of Nazis in Ukraine as a driver against Russia, the funding with massive amounts of money, including a new $40 billion influx from the United States, to give arms to those military forces that include Nazis in key positions. And we just saw the surrender at Mariupol of the last of the Azov Brigade holdouts. And the Western governments are quite upset because the Russians are saying they're going to investigate to see which ones are Nazis and put them possibly on trial for war crimes, for what they did in killing people in the Donbass. There was a video released yesterday which showed the people who just surrendered at Mariupol, the Azov battalions, and many of them have tattoos of Stefan Bandera, the World War II coordinator of the Ukrainian SS with the Nazi SS, tattoos of Hitler, swastikas, the Sonnenrad, and others. So the West is a little bit concerned that the Nazi connection will be exposed. Well, The Guardian had a headline several days ago, "Defenders of Mariupol are the heroes of our time." So the West, on behalf of the British banks of the City of London and Wall Street, has embraced Nazism. That's what this new economic and political order of London and Wall Street represents. That's what the pathetic Joe Biden and the equally pathetic Boris Johnson are leading the fight for. And that's what we have to mobilize to defeat. This Thursday, the Schiller Institute will be sponsoring a conference. I'll have a link to the invitation at the bottom of the description page. I urge you to not only sign up to attend yourself, it's an online conference, but get as many of your friends and associates as possible to join you. Thanks for joining me today. I'll see you again tomorrow.